1952. Northern England. A construction crew breaking ground on what would become the A628 Woodhead Pass discovered something that made the foreman drop his shovel and walk away from the site. Beneath 3 feet of peat and clay, they found a layer of human bones, not scattered, not haphazard, but arranged in a deliberate pattern stretching nearly half a mile along the proposed route. The bones weren't ancient. Forensic analysis would later suggest they'd been there less than a century. But what disturbed investigators most wasn't the age of the remains. It was the uniformity of the trauma. Every single skull showed the same catastrophic fracture pattern, as if each person had been killed in precisely the same manner at precisely the same location over the course of decades. The Ministry of Transport ordered the findings classified within 48 hours. Construction continued. The highway opened to the public in 1954, and for the next 70 years, those 99 souls remained a footnote in a file that was never meant to be opened. But here's what should haunt you. In every culture throughout history, crossroads have been considered places of supernatural significance, places where the boundary between worlds grows thin. The Romans believed spirits lingered at intersections. Medieval Christians buried criminals at crossroads to confuse their ghosts. So when 99 people died along the exact path where a modern highway would be built, was it coincidence? Or had something about that specific stretch of land been claiming lives long before asphalt ever touched it? Before we unravel this forgotten nightmare, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Because depending on your answer, you might be closer to one of these cursed roads than you think. The story begins not in 1952, but in 1847, when the Manchester and Sheffield Railway Company decided to bore a tunnel through the Pennine Mountains. The Woodhead Tunnel would be an engineering marvel, 3 miles of solid rock connecting Lancashire and Yorkshire, transforming commerce and travel across northern England. But the mountain resisted. From the first blast of dynamite, workers reported strange occurrences. Tools vanished overnight. Men heard voices in sections of tunnel where no one else was working. 3 experienced miners walked into a newly excavated shaft one morning and were never seen again. No collapse was recorded. No bodies were ever found. They simply vanished into the mountain, and the mountain kept the secret. The railway company suppressed these incidents. Production quotas mattered more than superstition, but the deaths mounted with disturbing regularity. Official records list 32 workers killed during the tunnel's construction between 1847 and 1852. Cholera, explosions, tunnel collapses. Each death was catalogued with clinical detachment, filed away in leather-bound ledgers that now crumble in the archives of the National Railway Museum. But those records don't tell the complete story. They don't mention the workers who fled in the middle of the night, abandoning their wages. They don't document the local women who refused to let their husbands return to the site after hearing about the Hollow Man. A figure workers claimed walked the incomplete tunnel, his footsteps echoing in chambers that hadn't been excavated yet. Dr. James Phillips, the company physician assigned to the Woodhead project, kept a separate diary. His entries were never intended for official record. In faded ink on water-stained pages, Phillips documented cases that defied medical explanation. Workers suffering from what he called mountain fever, a condition characterized by extreme paranoia, night terrors, and an obsessive need to return to the tunnel even after being sent home to recover. In one entry from October 1849, Phillips describes a navvy named Thomas Greenwood, who walked away from his shift, climbed to the highest point of the pass, and threw himself onto the rocks below. Before his death, Greenwood had scratched a message into the wall of his boarding house. The road demands payment. It always has. It always will. The tunnel was completed in 1852. Trains began running through the mountain, carrying passengers and freight, linking industrial cities that would power the British Empire. But the deaths didn't stop. Between 1852 and 1954, the year the adjacent highway opened, local parish records document 99 deaths along that specific stretch of the Pennines, not in the tunnel itself, but on the moorland above it. along the route where the future highway would run, 99 people. Over the course of a century, each death occurring within a half-mile corridor that followed the ridgeline with unnatural precision. Some were suicides, others were attributed to accidents, falls, exposure, animal attacks. A handful were ruled murders, though no suspects were ever charged. What links them isn't the manner of death. It's the pattern of behavior preceding each one. Witnesses consistently reported that victims experienced a dramatic personality change in the weeks before they died. Withdrawal from family, obsessive walking along the moorland path, references to hearing music or voices no one else could perceive, and in at least 17 documented cases, victims told relatives they felt called to the pass, that something was waiting for them there, something that had been waiting a very long time. The local community developed its own explanations. The Woodhead area had been inhabited since the Bronze Age. Archaeologists had discovered burial mounds, stone circles, and ritual sites scattered across the moorland. One theory suggested the railway tunnel and later the highway had desecrated ancient sacred ground, releasing something that fed on human life. Another tradition, passed down through generations of families in the nearby villages of Crowden and Woodhead, spoke of a tithe road, a path where travelers once made offerings to appease spirits of the mountain. According to this folklore, the offerings were meant to buy safe passage. But after the Industrial Revolution, after rail and road carved through the landscape without regard for old customs, the spirits stopped accepting tokens. They wanted something more substantial. They wanted lives. The academic establishment dismissed such talk as peasant superstition, but even skeptics couldn't explain the statistical anomaly. Dr. Margaret Holbrook, a lecturer in geography at the University of Manchester, conducted a comprehensive analysis in 1937 of accidental deaths across the Pennines. Her research, published in an obscure academic journal that ceased publications 3 years later, revealed something extraordinary. The death rate per square mile along the Woodhead Pass was 340% higher than any comparable stretch of moorland in northern England. When Holbrook attempted to follow up with a more detailed study in 1938, her funding was mysteriously withdrawn. Her request to access railway company medical records was denied, and when she submitted a revised paper to the Royal Geographical Society, it was rejected without review, a highly unusual move for an established researcher with Holbrook's credentials. Why would authorities suppress investigation into a clear pattern of deaths? The answer lies in economics and empire. By the 1932, Britain was recovering from the Great Depression. Infrastructure projects represented progress, employment, national revival. The last thing the government wanted was public panic about cursed land or haunted transportation routes. When preliminary plans for the Trans-Pennine Highway were drawn up in 1935, they followed the exact ridgeline where 99 people had died over the previous 83 years. Engineers chose that route because the geography made sense. The ridge provided the most direct path with the least severe gradients. But no one consulted the death records. Or if they did, those records were deemed irrelevant to modern planning. Construction of the A628 Woodhead Pass began in 1949, delayed by World War II but finally prioritized as part of Britain's post-war reconstruction. The Ministry of Transport wanted a modern highway connecting Manchester and Sheffield, reducing travel time and stimulating economic growth across the industrial north. The project was celebrated in Parliament as a symbol of Britain's future. But the man who actually dug into that moorland knew something was wrong from the very beginning. Albert Morrison, a surveyor who worked the initial site assessments, kept a record of anomalies that his supervisors refused to acknowledge. Equipment malfunctions occurred at rates far exceeding normal wear and tear. Compasses spun wildly at certain points along the route. And on multiple occasions, workers reported seeing figures standing on the moorland at dawn, figures that disappeared when approached but left footprints in the peat. Then came the discovery that would change everything. In August 1952, 3 years into construction, excavation crews working on the eastern section uncovered the bone layer. Not a single grave, not a burial site. A layer continuous, deliberate, and horrifying in its implications. The bones were human. The arrangement was intentional. And forensic examination revealed they belonged to 99 distinct individuals. The man tasked with making sense of the bone field was Dr. Edmund Blackwood, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Leeds who had spent the previous decade cataloging remains from medieval plague pits. Blackwood had seen mass graves before, chaotic jumbles of bodies thrown together in times of crisis, bones tangled without ceremony or care. But what he found beneath the Woodhead Pass was something entirely different. The remains had been placed with ritualistic precision. Each skeleton was positioned exactly 6 feet from the next, forming a line that curved gently along the natural contour of the ridge. Every body faced west toward the setting sun. And most disturbingly, every skull showed identical trauma, a single catastrophic fracture at the base, consistent with a powerful blow from a heavy, blunt object. Blackwood worked under extraordinary restrictions. The Ministry of Transport had given him 72 hours to complete his assessment before construction would resume. No photographs were permitted. No samples could be removed for extended laboratory analysis. He was allowed one assistant, a young doctoral student named Sarah Wickham, and access to a field tent set up beside the excavation. Under those conditions, Blackwood did what he could. He measured, he documented, and he grew increasingly disturbed by what the bones were telling him. The victims ranged in age from adolescence to late middle age, both men and women. The bone density and wear patterns suggested they came from various time periods, some dating to the early 1800s, others possibly as recent as the 1922nd. This wasn't a single massacre. It was decades of killing, with bodies carefully placed in a growing line that stretched across the moorland like a grotesque monument. But here's what made Blackwood's hands shake as he wrote his final report. The positioning of the bodies suggested they had been placed there while still alive. Soil samples taken from beneath several skeletons contained organic material consistent with human blood that had seeped into the ground. The fracture patterns on the skulls showed no signs of defensive wounds on the arms or hands. These people hadn't fought. They had knelt or stood and accepted the blow that killed them. Blackwood submitted his preliminary findings on the 23rd of August 1952. His report was 47 pages long, meticulously detailed, and concluded with a recommendation that construction be halted pending a full criminal investigation. The Ministry of Transport received the report on August 24. On August 25, Blackwood was informed that his services were no longer required. His report was classified under the Official Secrets Act, and on August 26, construction resumed, as if nothing had been found. Sarah Wickham, Blackwood's assistant, refused to let it rest. She had spent 3 days and nights at the bone field, documenting details her mentor hadn't had time to record. She had noticed something Blackwood missed, or perhaps something he chose not to include in his official report. Among the bones, scattered throughout the entire length of the excavation, were small metal objects. Wickham had collected 17 of them: coins, buttons, pieces of jewelry, a tin whistle, fragments of a pocket watch, personal items, offerings, each one placed deliberately beside a skeleton, as if the victim had brought something precious to leave behind. Wickham took her findings to the local newspaper, the Glossop Chronicle. The editor, Thomas Hartley, was initially skeptical. Stories about cursed highways and ritual murders belonged in penny dreadfuls, not serious journalism. But Hartley was also a man who remembered his grandfather's warnings about the Woodhead Pass, stories passed down through generations of locals who avoided that stretch of moorland after dark. He agreed to investigate. What he uncovered would consume the last year of his life and ultimately destroy his career. Hartley began with parish records, the meticulous documentation of births, marriages, and deaths maintained by local churches for centuries. In the villages surrounding Woodhead, Tintwistle, Crowden, Hollingworth, Dunford Bridge, he found gaps, years where death records simply stopped, then resumed months later with no explanation for the missing entries. But more intriguing were the marginal notes, brief comments written by parish priests in the careful script of men who knew they were documenting something they didn't fully understand. A note from 1823. 3 souls departed this week, all upon the high road, all in the same manner. God have mercy. Another from 1867. The old custom continues, though none will speak of it openly. I fear for my flock. And a particularly chilling entry from 1901. 17 years since the last offering. Some say the peace cannot last. The road grows hungry. The road grows hungry. That phrase appeared multiple times across different parishes, different decades, written by priests who had no contact with one another. It suggested a shared understanding, a communal knowledge that transcended individual experience. Hartley began interviewing elderly residents, men and women whose grandparents had lived through the railway tunnel construction in the years that followed. What emerged was a oral tradition that had survived precisely because it was never written down, never formalized into something that could be officially denied. The tradition spoke of a bargain made long ago, before written history, when the first people settled in the shadow of the Pennines. The mountain was alive, not metaphorically, but genuinely conscious in a way that predated human understanding of consciousness. It demanded acknowledgement. It required sacrifice. And in exchange, it allowed passage through its domain. For centuries, the local population honored this bargain. Once every generation, someone would volunteer to walk the high path, to carry their most precious possession to the place where the rich met the sky, and there they would kneel and accept their fate. It wasn't murder in any conventional sense, it was covenant. And those who died were honored, their names remembered in songs that were only sung on the longest night of winter. But industrialization broke the covenant. The railway company blasted through the mountain without asking permission, without offering anything in return. The old families tried to maintain the tradition, but younger generations rejected what they saw as barbaric superstition. The volunteers became fewer. The gaps between offerings grew longer. And during those gaps, the mountain took what it was owed in other ways. Accidents, suicides, disappearances. The 99 people whose bones lay beneath the highway route weren't all volunteers. Some were choosing to honor the old ways even as society moved past them, but others were simply taken, claimed by something that demanded its due, whether humans acknowledged it or not. Hartley's investigation revealed something even more disturbing. The last confirmed voluntary offering occurred in 1934. A man named Joseph Brennan, aged 47, who walked onto the moorland one October morning and never returned. His body was found 3 days later at the highest point of the pass, a single massive trauma to the base of his skull. Local police ruled it an accident. But Brennan's widow told Hartley a different story. Her husband had been visited by village elders, men in their 70s and 80s who still remembered when the tradition was openly practiced. They told Brennan that the mountain was growing restless, that something terrible would happen if the offering wasn't made. Brennan, a devout Catholic who also respected the older beliefs that existed before Christianity, agreed to go. He spent his final evening at home with his family, then walked into the darkness carrying his father's pocket watch, the same watch Sarah Wickham had found among the bones 18 years later. After Brennan's death, there were no more volunteers. The younger generation wanted nothing to do with what they viewed as pagan ritual. The village elders died, taking their knowledge to graves that would never be opened. And in 1949, construction on the highway began. The Ministry of Transport carved through the moorland with modern machinery, treating the landscape as inert material to be shaped according to human will. They found the bones in 1952, classified the discovery, and continued building. The highway opened in 1954, and for 2 decades it served its purpose without incident. Then the accidents began. The first occurred on the 3rd of November 1974. A family of 4 traveling from Manchester to Sheffield lost control of their vehicle at the highest point of the pass. The car veered off the road and rolled down the embankment. All 4 died instantly. Police investigators found no mechanical failure, no evidence of impaired driving. The road was dry, visibility was clear. The driver, a 40-year-old accountant named David Fletcher, was described by everyone who knew him as cautious and experienced. There was no reason for the crash. It simply happened. 3 months later, a lorry driver named Patrick Mills jackknifed on the same stretch of highway. Mills survived but told investigators something that troubled them deeply. He claimed that just before losing control, he saw someone standing in the middle of the road, a figure dressed in old-fashioned clothing who appeared without warning and vanished just as quickly. Mills swerved to avoid hitting what he was certain was a person, and in doing so, lost control of his vehicle. When police searched the area, they found no one, no footprints in the snow that lined the roadside, no witnesses to corroborate Mills' story. The official report attributed the accident to driver fatigue. Over the next 15 years, the A628 Woodhead Pass developed a reputation as one of the most dangerous stretches of highway in England. The accident rate was staggering, 4 times higher than any comparable road. Investigators identified no structural problems with the highway itself. The asphalt was well maintained. The curve radius was within safety standards. Lighting was adequate. Yet vehicles continued to crash with disturbing regularity, often at the exact same location, the highest point of the pass, directly above where the bone field had been discovered, and then delivered by 1989. The Highway Safety Executive had launched its third inquiry into the 628 Woodhead Pass. Senior investigator Malcolm Crawford approached the assignment with professional skepticism. He had spent 20 years analyzing traffic patterns, road conditions, and driver behavior. He didn't believe in curses or vengeful spirits. He believed in data. But the data from Woodhead Pass made no sense. Crawford compiled statistics that should have been impossible. Between 1974 and 1989, there had been 147 accidents on that specific stretch of highway. 63 people had died. And of those 63 deaths, an overwhelming majority occurred at night during clear weather on a straight section of road with perfect visibility. Crawford interviewed survivors. Their accounts shared disturbing similarities. Many reported seeing figures on or near the road immediately before the accidents, figures that vanished upon impact or investigation. Others described sudden mechanical failures that couldn't be replicated when their vehicles were examined later. Some spoke of overwhelming drowsiness that came without warning, or a compulsion to drive faster despite consciously wanting to slow down. One woman, a nurse named Patricia Hollis, who survived the near-fatal crash in 1987, told Crawford something that kept him awake for weeks afterward. She said that in the moments before her car left the road, she heard singing a low, rhythmic chant in a language she didn't recognize, coming from inside her own vehicle even though she was alone. Crawford did what any good investigator would do. He expanded his research beyond immediate accident data. He requested access to historical records, planning documents, and construction files from the highway's development. Most of what he requested was readily available. But when he asked for the forensic reports from the 1952 Bonefield discovery, he was told those files were classified under the Official Secrets Act and would remain sealed until 2027, 75 years after the finding. When Crawford pressed for justification, he was informed that his inquiry should focus on current safety concerns, not historical anomalies. 3 weeks later, Crawford was reassigned to a different project. The investigation into Woodhead Pass was quietly closed with recommendations for improved signage and reduced speed limits, measures that would do nothing to address the actual problem. But Crawford had made copies of everything before his reassignment. And in his personal files, secured in his home office, he had assembled something no official investigation could acknowledge: a pattern that stretched back more than a century, connecting the railway tunnel deaths, the 99 bodies, and the modern highway accidents into a single, continuous narrative of a place that demanded human life with mechanical regularity, arrayedly buried beneath tons of filled dirt and asphalt. The number mattered. 99 wasn't arbitrary. Crawford cross-referenced it against every cultural and historical tradition he could find. In Celtic numerology, 99 represented completion, before the final transformation, the last moment before reaching 100, the number of perfection and closure. In some pre-Christian British traditions, 99 was the number of souls required to maintain balance between the physical and spiritual worlds. A tithe paid not to gods, but to the land itself. Crawford began to understand what the village elders had known, what Thomas Hartley had discovered before his newspaper went bankrupt and his findings were dismissed as the ravings of a man who'd spent too long chasing ghosts. The highway had been built over a place of offering. The 99 bodies weren't victims of a serial killer or the casualties of some forgotten tragedy. They were the physical evidence of a covenant that had existed for longer than Christianity, longer than Roman occupation, perhaps longer than human memory could reach. And when construction desecrated that site, when bulldozers and excavators churned through the bones and scattered them beneath tons of filled dirt, the covenant didn't end. It simply found new ways to collect what it was owed. Crawford calculated the death toll from highway accidents. By 1989, 63 people had died on the pass. Add the 32 official deaths during railway tunnel construction and you reach 95. 4 more deaths would complete the pattern. Crawford made a prediction that he shared with no one. If his theory was correct, there would be exactly 4 more fatal accidents on the Woodhead Pass, and then the deaths would stop. He was wrong about one thing. The deaths didn't stop, but they did change. On the 12th of March 1991, a coach carrying 37 passengers lost control on a Woodhead Pass. The driver, a veteran with 20 years of experience and a spotless safety record, later testified that his brakes failed completely despite a full mechanical inspection 3 days prior. The coach plunged down the embankment. 4 people died. 40, 63, 95, 99. The pattern was complete. And then, for almost 3 decades, the accidents stopped. Not completely, the A628 remained a challenging road, and occasional crashes still occurred. But the frequency dropped to levels consistent with similar highways across the country. The statistical anomaly vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Emergency responders and local police noticed but didn't question their good fortune. The few people who remembered the road's dark history assumed the curse, if it had ever existed, had finally exhausted itself. Malcolm Crawford died in 2003. His personal files, including all his research on the Woodhead Pass, were inherited by his daughter, who donated them to the Transport Research Laboratory with instructions that they be made available to researchers. In 2019, a graduate student named Rachel Voss was conducting research on historical traffic safety when she discovered Crawford's archive. What she read convinced her that something profound had been dismissed as superstition, something that might hold keys to understanding how human psychology, landscape, and trauma intersect in ways modern science struggles to acknowledge. Voss traveled to Woodhead. She interviewed elderly residents, the last generation, with living memory of the stories Thomas Hartley had collected. She visited the section of highway where so many had died, standing at the highest point of the pass as the sun set over the Pennines. And she accessed records that Crawford had never seen, declassified documents from the 1,952 discovery that had been released in 2027 as scheduled, then promptly filed away in archives where no one thought to look for them. The declassified reports contained photographs. Edmund Blackwood had been forbidden from taking pictures, but someone else, possibly a Ministry of Transport official documenting the find for internal records, had photographed the bone field before it was destroyed. The images showed exactly what Blackwood had described, a precise line of skeletons stretching across the moorland, each positioned with ritualistic care. But the photographs also revealed something Blackwood hadn't mentioned in his report, or perhaps hadn't noticed. At the western end of the bone line, where the last skeleton lay, there was a gap, a space exactly 6 feet long waiting to be filled. Voss published her findings in a academic journal specializing in folklore and material culture. Her paper, Landscape, Memory, and Repeated Trauma, the Woodhead Pass Phenomenon, presented Crawford's research alongside her own investigation, arguing that the deaths weren't supernatural in any mystical sense, but rather represented a complex interaction between place, cultural memory, and psychological susceptibility. Communities that lived close to dangerous landscapes developed traditions to manage their danger. When those traditions were suppressed or forgotten, the danger didn't vanish, it simply became inexplicable, transformed from understood ritual into random tragedy. The paper attracted modest attention in academic circles and was completely ignored everywhere else. The A628 Woodhead Pass remains open today, carrying thousands of vehicles every week between Manchester and Sheffield. Modern travelers speed along its curves with no knowledge of what lies beneath the asphalt, no awareness of the 99 who died there or the centuries-old bargain their deaths might have represented. The highway has been resurfaced multiple times, widened in sections, equipped with modern safety features. It's just a road now, practical and mundane. But there are still nights when drivers report strange experiences. Figures seen in headlights that vanish before impact. Mechanical failures that repair themselves. A sensation of being watched from the empty moorland that stretches on either side of the highway. These reports are infrequent enough to be dismissed as individual misperceptions, the natural anxiety of driving through an isolated area after dark. They're not investigated. They're not recorded in any official capacity. They're just stories, the kind of stories every road accumulates over time. Rachel Voss returned to the Woodhead Pass one final time before publishing her paper. She went at dawn, alone, and walked the moorland above the highway where the bone field had been discovered. The land has been partially restored to grassland, though the scars of construction are still visible if you know where to look. Voss stood at the highest point, where the ridge meets the sky, and tried to imagine what those 99 individuals had experienced in their final moments. Had they been afraid? Had they understood what they were doing and why? Or had they simply known that some bargains once made continue long past the point where anyone remembers making them? She found something that morning. Half buried in a peat, barely visible among the grass and heather, was a small metal object, a button brass corroded by decades of exposure. It might have been dropped by a hiker, a relic from a discarded coat, or it might have been something else, an offering, left by someone who still remembered the old ways, who still believed that some debts must be acknowledged even if the world has moved past them. Voss kept the button. She never mentioned it in her paper or to her colleagues. But sometimes, late at night in her university office, she takes it out and turns it over in her hands, feeling the weight of it, wondering what stories he could tell if metal could speak. She thinks about Malcolm Crawford, driven from his investigation for asking the wrong questions. She thinks about Thomas Hartley, who bankrupted himself chasing a truth no one wanted to hear. She thinks about Edmund Blackwood and Sarah Wickham, who documented evidence that was immediately classified and forgotten. And she thinks about the 99 whose names are lost but whose deaths created a pattern so precise it defies coincidence. The highway that took 99 lives is still there. You can drive it tomorrow if you want. The speed limit is 60 miles per hour, reduced to 40 in certain sections. There are warning signs about sharp curves and high winds. There are emergency telephones every mile, painted bright orange so they're visible in fog. It's as safe as modern engineering can make it. But safety is a relative term, isn't it? Because the question that haunts every serious investigation of the Woodhead Pass isn't whether the deaths will continue. It's whether they ever really stopped, or if they've simply become so diffuse, so spread out across time and distance, that we can no longer see the pattern. History has a way of forgetting what it finds inconvenient. We pave over the past, literally and figuratively, and tell ourselves that progress has erased the old superstitions. But sometimes, when you dig deep enough and you look at the data without preconception, when you listen to the stories people are afraid to tell, in daylight you find that the past isn't gone. It's just waiting. And some roads, no matter how modern they appear, are still hungry. So here's my question for you, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. What roads do you travel every day without knowing the history? What ground do you walk on without understanding what lies beneath? Because the Woodhead Pass isn't unique. It's just one of the places where the evidence survived long enough to be documented before it was buried again. How many other highways, how many other railways, how many other conveniences of modern life are built over places that demanded something in return? And if those bargains were never properly ended, if they were just interrupted and paved over, what happens when the debt comes due? If this story unsettled you, if it made you think about the landscapes you move through without seeing, then do something with that discomfort. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more forgotten histories that refuse to stay buried. Because the past is always closer than we think, and the roads we travel every day might remember things we've deliberately forgotten. The highway that took 99 lives is still there, waiting. And sometimes, late at night when traffic is sparse and the moorland stretches dark and empty on either side, drivers still see figures standing where no one should be, still hear singing in languages no one speaks anymore. They'll tell you about it if you ask, though they'll laugh nervously afterward, dismissing their own experience as imagination or fatigue. But their hands will shake slightly as they speak, and their eyes will hold a question they don't want to answer. What if it wasn't imagination? What if some places never forget, and some debts are never truly paid?